They wore no crowns. They led no armies. But they stood at the heart of power, watching, serving, surviving. For centuries, dwarfs walked the golden halls of kings and queens, not as rulers, but as silent witnesses to history. They were dressed in silk, painted in portraits, and paraded before crowds. Yet their names were forgotten. Behind every smile was a story untold. Behind every costume, a human soul. This is not just a story about royal courts. It is a story about dignity, invisibility, and the quiet strength of those history chose to overlook. Till now. When we think about kings, queens, and royal courts, we often imagine strong warriors, beautiful queens in shiny dresses, and rich people wearing gold. We think of big palaces, grand dinners, and powerful speeches. But there is a part of this world that is almost forgotten. In the corners of these big rooms, standing near the thrones, were people we don't often hear about. Dwarfs. They were not rulers, they had no crowns, and they gave no orders. Yet they stood next to kings, walked through golden halls, and lived inside the most powerful homes in the world. These were people born with dwarfism, short in height, but their presence in royal life was huge. History didn't talk much about them, but they were there, watching, serving, and sometimes becoming close to the royal family. Many were entertainers. Some made the kings and queens laugh. Others became trusted helpers or friends. They played with royal children, traveled with nobles, and lived inside the palace walls. But they were more than just entertainers. They were quiet witnesses to secrets, arguments, love stories, and even the fall of empires. Royal life was like a show, and dwarfs were sometimes used to make it look even more special. They were rare, and that made them important in the eyes of rulers. Some people believed they brought good luck or had spiritual power. Others saw them as a way to show off wealth and control. But these were real people with real lives, not just decorations or toys. They laughed, cried, felt fear, and made strong connections. They were part of the royal story, even if history forgot their names. But how did these small figures find themselves standing beside the most powerful rulers in the world? Most dwarfs were not born into royal life. They did not come from rich families or noble bloodlines. Many were born in small villages or poor homes. Their families often struggled to feed everyone, and when a child was born with dwarfism, life became even harder. Some parents believed that sending their child to live in a royal palace would give them a better future. Others had no choice at all. In some places, dwarfs were found by royal scouts, men who searched the towns and markets for anything rare or unusual. A child with dwarfism was seen as something special, something that could impress a king or queen. These scouts would take the child and bring them to the court. In a few cases, dwarfs were even bought or traded, just like rare animals or expensive gifts. Sometimes, one royal family would send a dwarf to another court as a gift. This was a way to show respect, or to start a friendship between powerful houses. In these moments, dwarfs were not treated as people, but as symbols of wealth or good luck. No matter how they arrived, one thing was clear: the decision was rarely their own. A child might leave home at a very young age, never to see their family again. Their future now belonged to the palace. Some were carried in fine carriages, dressed in silk, and introduced with music and applause. But behind the shiny welcome, there was fear, confusion, and loneliness. These young dwarfs were walking into a new world, one filled with gold, rules, and powerful people. They were no longer just children. They were now part of something bigger, something they didn't fully understand. Some might have felt lucky. Others might have felt like prisoners in beautiful cages. But once they entered those marble halls and golden rooms, what kind of life truly awaited them? Life inside the palace was full of beauty and strict rules. For the dwarfs who arrived there, everything changed. At first, many people thought they were only there to entertain, to sing, dance, make jokes, or do tricks for the king and queen. And yes, some were made to act as jesters, wearing funny clothes and making others laugh. But this was not the only role they played. In many royal courts, dwarfs became more than performers. They were trusted helpers. Some were given the job of taking care of royal children. They played with the young princes and princesses, told them stories, and stayed by their side day and night. Because of this closeness, some dwarfs became like family to the children, and the bond between them could last for life. Others were personal attendants to queens and noble ladies. They helped them dress, listened to their private thoughts, and even followed them during travels. In some cases, dwarfs were used as guards during long journeys because they were seen as loyal and less likely to betray the people they served. Their size allowed them to move quietly and go unnoticed in dangerous places, which sometimes made them useful in ways others were not. Dwarfs often had access to the most private parts of the palace: bedrooms, secret meetings, and behind-the-scenes discussions. They were always near the people in power. They heard things, saw things, and remembered everything. While they didn't always have a public voice, their quiet presence held a kind of power. In some rare situations, a dwarf became more than just a servant. They became a close friend, a trusted listener, someone who could speak honestly to the king or queen without fear. This trust was rare in the royal world, where most people had their own goals and secrets. So, while many outside the palace saw them only as funny figures or decorations, inside the palace they were much more. They were workers, helpers, protectors, and sometimes silent witnesses to the rise and fall of great leaders. They stood close to thrones, but did that closeness mean they were truly seen? In royal courts, everything people saw was carefully planned. The way a king dressed, the animals in the gardens, the gold on the walls, each detail was meant to send a message. Look how rich and powerful I am. This idea of image was very important, and dwarfs became part of that image. Because people with dwarfism were rare, rulers often saw them as symbols of something special. Having a dwarf in the court showed that the king or queen had power, money, and control over unusual things. It was not always about laughter. Sometimes it was about showing off. Dwarfs were dressed in expensive clothes. They wore jewelry, fine shoes, and sometimes held fans or other royal items. In official paintings, they were placed next to the king or queen, standing proudly as part of the royal group. In the Spanish court, artists painted dwarfs in beautiful clothing, giving them space and respect in the image. But still, they were there to support the picture of power. Palaces were like theaters where everything was done for show. Exotic birds flew across gardens, strange animals were kept in cages, and rare people like dwarfs walked through the halls. They were seen not just as humans, but as part of the collection that made the palace exciting and different. Sometimes, a dwarf was even used in royal gifts. One king might send a dwarf to another court to show friendship, or to impress another ruler with his wealth and reach. In this way, dwarfs were treated almost like living treasures. To the outside world, it looked grand and magical. The palace was full of beauty and mystery. But being part of that show was not always easy. Dwarfs had to smile, play their roles, and follow the rules of the royal image. But behind these polished portraits and theatrical parades was a private world far more complicated. From the outside, the royal court looked like a dream. Beautiful rooms, shining clothes, and delicious food made it seem like the perfect place to live. And for some dwarfs, parts of this dream were real. They slept in soft beds, wore fine clothes, and were close to powerful people. But palace life was not the same for everyone. Some dwarfs were treated with care and kindness. They had private rooms, good food, and even learned to read and write. Queens or princesses trusted them, and they were allowed to speak freely in private. They were given respect in small but important ways. But others lived under strict control. Every part of their life was managed. What they wore, where they stood, how they spoke, even when they laughed. They were sometimes dressed in strange or colorful costumes, not for their comfort, but to catch attention or amuse guests. They were told to perform jokes, dances, or songs during events, even when they were tired or sad. If they refused to perform, they could be punished or pushed out of the court. Even when they were sick or unhappy, they were expected to entertain. Their job was not just to serve, but to keep the court smiling, no matter how they felt inside. Their days could be long and tiring. During festivals or big dinners, they were made to walk through the halls, wave to guests, or act in plays made to make people laugh at their size. Sometimes they were given names that weren't their own, or made fun of in public. They were always being watched, never truly free. Yet many of them found ways to survive, and even build quiet strength. They formed bonds with royal children, gave honest advice to nobles, and learned the rules of the court better than anyone else. They smiled when they needed to, but they remembered everything. For some, court life was service. For others, it became performance, sometimes cruel, sometimes absurd. In some royal courts, dwarfs were not just part of the background, they were turned into the main attraction. People came to the palace expecting to be amazed, and kings wanted to impress their guests with things they had never seen before. Dwarfs, because of their size and rarity, were sometimes treated like performers in a strange show. One of the most shocking examples was a dwarf wedding organized by a powerful European ruler in the 1700s. This was not a normal wedding. Everything was planned as entertainment. The bride and groom were both dwarfs. The guests were dwarfs. Even the musicians and the priest were dwarfs. The palace dressed them in clothes made with gold and silver, placed them in royal carriages, and created a wedding that looked like a small copy of a real royal ceremony. People laughed and clapped. They watched the event like it was a theater performance. But for the people involved, it was real. They were not puppets or dolls. They were human beings with feelings, dreams, and pride. Yet, the court used their lives to create a moment of surprise and fun for others. Events like these show the line between service and spectacle. Dwarfs were not always seen as individuals. Sometimes they were used to create a sense of wonder, just like fireworks or strange animals brought from faraway lands. Their bodies became part of the show. This kind of treatment was not rare. In different places, Spain, France, the Ottoman Empire, even Mughal India, dwarfs were brought out during public events to dance, perform tricks, or simply stand as decoration. They were expected to smile, entertain, and accept the laughter around them, whether or not it hurt. And yet, the pain of being treated like an object did not stop them from surviving. Many found quiet ways to keep their dignity, even while being watched. But what if the dwarf wasn't a servant at court, but a royal child born with dwarfism? Most dwarfs in royal courts came from outside the palace, brought in to serve or entertain. But sometimes, a child with dwarfism was born into a royal or noble family. In a world where image was everything, this created a problem for the rulers. A royal child with dwarfism did not fit the perfect picture of strength and beauty that kings and queens wanted to show the world. In some cases, these children were hidden away. Families sent them to quiet country homes, religious places, or private estates, far from the eyes of the court. They were not spoken about in public, and their names were left out of official records. It was not always out of cruelty. Sometimes it was to protect them from judgment and gossip. Still, their lives became lonely, separated from their families and forgotten by history. But not every story was the same. In a few rare cases, noble families accepted their children with dwarfism. They dressed them in the same fine clothes as their siblings. They gave them teachers, books, and roles in family life. These children were still seen as part of the royal world, even if others did not always understand or accept them. These stories show that attitudes were different across places and times. Some courts were strict and fearful. Others were more open, at least in private. But because many of these children were kept away from the public, we know very little about their real lives. We only find small signs in personal letters, old records, or family stories passed down through generations. When the world tried to forget them, one place still remembered: the canvas of the painter. In many royal portraits from the past, we see kings in fine robes, queens holding flowers, and children standing tall and proud. But if you look closely, you'll also find dwarfs in these paintings, standing nearby, holding objects, or simply watching from the side. They were often included to show the wealth and power of the court. But in the hands of some artists, these images became much more. One of the most famous painters to show dwarfs with honesty and respect was Diego Velázquez from Spain. He painted several dwarfs who lived in the court of King Philip IV. But unlike other artists, he did not turn them into jokes or decorations. He gave them space, emotion, and importance in his work. In one powerful painting, a dwarf named Sebastián de Mora sits alone, looking straight at the viewer. He wears dark clothing, his hands rest quietly, and his face is serious, not smiling, not performing. There is no crown, no spotlight, just a human being captured with care. Through this painting we see his dignity, his quiet strength, and perhaps even his pain. Velázquez painted these individuals not just because they were part of the court, but because he saw them as people with stories worth remembering. In a time when dwarfs were often used for show, his art gave them something rare: respect. These portraits are more than just pictures. They are windows into lives that history tried to forget. Through paint and canvas, their presence was saved. We may not know their full stories, but their faces remain, looking back at us from the walls of museums. Even if their names were lost to time, their presence remained in brushstrokes, and in the quiet corners of palace memory. Not every dwarf in the royal court was there just to serve or entertain. Some over time became trusted and powerful in quiet ways. They were always near the king or queen, standing behind chairs, walking beside them, or sitting nearby during private talks. Because of this closeness, they often heard secrets, saw emotions others didn't, and understood the true heart of the palace. Some rulers grew so comfortable with their dwarf attendants that they began to trust them more than their nobles or advisors. A dwarf might hear the king's anger before anyone else. A queen might cry in front of the dwarf who helped her dress, speaking words she would never share in public. These moments gave the dwarf silent power, the kind that comes not from speaking loudly, but from knowing deeply. They did not hold official titles. Their names were not written in history books. But they sometimes gave advice, shared warnings, or made suggestions that changed decisions. Their small voices, spoken in quiet halls, could shape big choices. In a world full of competition, lies, and games, dwarfs were often seen as loyal and honest. This made them special. While others fought for power, they stood still, listened, and waited. Their loyalty was sometimes rewarded with special gifts, better living spaces, or a deeper place in the ruler's heart. But their influence was not loud. It lived in the background, in private rooms, in moments no one else saw. They shaped stories without writing them. They lived close to history, even if history forgot them. Their roles faded with the monarchies they served, but their echoes still remain. As time passed, the great palaces slowly became quiet. The kings and queens who once ruled the world lost their crowns, and the royal courts changed forever. The people who had lived in those golden halls faded from memory. Among them were the dwarfs, never rulers themselves, but always near the center of power. Their stories were not written in large books. Their names are missing from most records. But they were there, watching, serving, listening, surviving. They were part of the heartbeat of royal life, even if history chose to look the other way. They remind us that power is not always about being tall, strong, or loud. Sometimes real strength is silent. It lives in patience, in loyalty, and in the ability to see everything without being seen. The dwarfs in royal courts were more than symbols or servants. They were human beings with full lives, feeling love, fear, pride, and pain like anyone else. Their journey forces us to ask deeper questions. Who do we choose to remember? Whose stories do we leave out? Why do we focus only on those who wore crowns when others, standing quietly nearby, also shaped the world? Today we live in a time that talks about equality, fairness, and inclusion. But even now, many people with differences are still pushed aside. The lives of dwarfs in history remind us how easy it is to forget the quiet ones, and how important it is to see them fully, as people, not just as part of the background. They weren't kings or queens, but they stood beside them. Their voices were small, but their stories are vast. And sometimes it's the quietest presence in the room, holding a fan, whispering a truth, that carries the deepest legacy of all.